And I need to make sure that there is enough space because in one of my other classes, I ran out of space halfway through the class, so we should still be good today. All right, so let's go to here. All right. And by the way, I'm not sure how many of you like to watch robot competitions. So I included a few links. Some of you may have noticed that I included a few links at the very beginning of the website of this class, because I think sometimes it's inspiring to kind of have something to watch and say, well, where are we heading? So this is cisp440. I added like 3 links here. This one is particularly kind of interesting because I thought BattleBots were dead. Okay, nobody cared anymore. Apparently that is not the case. So I'm not going to show you all 15 minutes. That would be, if I don't have anything to teach in this class, that's what I would do. Just show you videos all day long, right? But I do have stuff that I need to go through. But I want to show you just the finale, which is kind of like the last few battles. I'm not sure whether I can get the sound to work here. Sorry?
I heard it's really popular in China.
Probably in Japan. Okay, so let me see if I can bump up the volume. Oh, not this one. Okay, let's go to playback. And then we have to use. Nope. But it's not hooking up. It's okay. It's just really. This is the last battle. And these two, it's not even a very good match. There's another match earlier that is actually even better, because it's a very even match. Both robots got completely disabled, so they have to gauge or decide who gets to win. I think this is this one. This one's really kind of cool. So I just want to show you this first. Okay. And they're trying to chew up the tires out of each other. But these are all remotely controlled. So as fun as it is to watch, you're basically watching, remotely, super duper fancy and dangerous remotely controlled vehicles. Okay. And each team has several people remotely controlling the robots potentially, because some of these have multiple controls. Like one person can drive it, and there's another mechanism to kind of like turn the drum or make it pop up, to right itself up, because sometimes they can flip each other, upside down. And this is the one where both robots got disabled, and this is another one that is kind of interesting.
Was this saw blade on it?
Yeah, there's a saw blade on one, and there's a drum on the other one. So.
Powered, like something like a saw blade would be a lot of energy, wouldn't it?
Oh yeah. Well, the plexiglass, surrounding the audience is like a 1-inch thick plexiglass enclosure. Okay, which is really thick. Okay, if you go to a bank to stop a bullet, this is like worse than stopping a bullet, because the amount of energy of these things is tremendous.
She wanted to know about the batteries.
Sorry?
She wanted to know about the batteries.
Oh, the batteries?
Yeah, like, I don't know, it just seems like that'd be a lot of energy.
Yep, there is. And because technology has improved so much over the years, these robots are far more destructive than, let's say, 15 years ago. Because 15 years ago, there was no lithium-ion or lithium polymer batteries. So people had to rely on NiCad, which is the best choice at the time. And NiCad batteries are pretty heavy, and they cannot really supply that much energy over the course of a battle. But these days, because they use lithium polymer batteries, that means you have more energy, less mass consumed by the battery, so you have more mass to put onto the robot, to put into the. This one turned out. This is the final match, and it was actually so quick that it wasn't even fun. Because the smaller one, the lower one, just chewed up all the tires of the big guy, so it was just completely disabled in the field. So there wasn't really a whole lot of actual battle. It's just that chewing up all his wheels. So now that the other one is no longer moving, it's KO. It's basically considered a knockout, and that's the end of it. So it was a very lackluster type of fight finale of this particular BattleBot. But what I would like to point out is the type of energy that you're talking about, because there was one in one of the battles. You guys can watch the details. But in one of the robots, the robot itself actually got flung onto the plexiglass, the whole robot. And we are probably talking about 200 to 300 pound robot going at easily 15, 20 miles per hour. It got flipped by the other one, so the entire robot just kind of collided into the plexiglass. The plexiglass held, but there was one instance where an audience put his or her hand on the plexiglass, and then the robot got flung onto the plexiglass. It did not break the plexiglass, but the energy transmitted through the plexiglass, so that the person who put the hand on the plexiglass ended up with a kind of gushing wound, with blood coming out of it. It's just from the energy. It's not because of the actual cut or anything like that. It's just the energy itself. Yeah. Yep. I guess it's the pulse of the energy that's causing the injury. So that's a lot of interesting things about that. But it's not impressive to me, okay, as fun as it is to watch, because these are remotely controlled robots. You have a team of people controlling a single robot. Now they're well coordinated, they're well trained, they put a lot of time into doing the whole thing, but they're not autonomous. Okay, so meanwhile, in autonomous snooze land, you have these autonomous robots. These are actually not BattleBots. The title actually got it wrong. They're not combat bots. These are called Sumo bots. Okay, so they do sumo type wrestling, where they try to push each other out of the ring. They're not destructive. Okay, they just need to push each other out of the ring. So these are autonomous, and apparently this is one of the kind of slow matches. Okay, this is the pace of the autonomous ones. Okay, it's like, oh yeah, I'm pushing you. Oh no, you're pushing me. I'm gonna go away. Maybe if I can sense which direction I'm going. It's so slow. So as I said, this is snooze land. But if you want, okay, if you want to watch the actual, okay, that's not the. These are the actual sumo wrestlers. But the All Japan ones, okay, look at the pace of this one, okay? They have a time release, so after a certain delay they activate. Now we are talking about autonomous. These are all fully autonomous. There's no way a person can react that quickly. So this one is you can see how fast that thing is. But the algorithm is actually very simple. Okay, it just needs to go really fast, find out where it is in the circle, so it doesn't that fraction of a second.
Detective here with the referees right now.
Yes. Probably something had happened in the past.
They must have a weight limit on the robot. It seems like really
yeah,
heavy.
there are different classes, just like real sumo matches. They have different classes. Oh, there was. I don't know what happened. Oh, okay. I think one lost traction, but the other one didn't have enough traction to go. Oh, it wedged in.
So they have to shut it down.
Yeah, they had to shut it down because it wedged in. Some of these robots, because they use a suction mechanism to improve traction,
Right.
they can actually compete upside down.
Uh-huh.
Because they have enough traction or enough suction that it can hold on to a surface upside down and still be able to play the game. So there's that. Okay, I just find it's to be a little bit interesting, but these are not destructive, so they don't have to factor in a lot of stuff the BattleBots actually have to factor in, because in the BattleBot the arena itself also has destructive devices like saws and screws and whatnot and flamethrowers. This is a whole lot simpler. That's just not a very good design.
They're trying to confuse the other one. Huh?
It's trying to confuse the other one, kind of like a
Bullfighter.
Yeah.
Cage. Yeah.
Yeah, because these all rely on very simple sensors. They are not radars of any kind. It's optical sensor. So when they see a reflection in a certain direction, it would think the robot is in that direction. So in that case, it can trick the other robot to kind of push out. That's a really slow robot, but has a lot of traction. So it can win by not intelligence, but just by sheer traction. It's like brute force. It's just brute force, pushing the. So this one is a real match of traction versus torque. It's so. So there are different strategies.
Slow and steady.
Yep. So there you have it. Robotics. But I think in the end, with classes like this, will connect to robotics at some point because there's no way that we're going to keep doing things manually anymore. Okay.
6 million men versus autonomous evil pro.
Yes. Yes. In fact, it is right at the right time spot too. So this is like from 1975. Somebody came up with this idea already that a probe that they were planning to send to Venus. Okay, I don't know why they want to send something to Venus, but the plan was to send it to Venus, and then it got activated on Earth because it's fully autonomous. It was planning to do stuff that is less than desirable, and a $6 million man, Lee Major, is supposed to go stop it. But the idea of the danger of a fully autonomous robot going rogue, was definitely there in 1975. People thought of hey, what if we have a robot that is supposed to be fully autonomous and we lost control of that because they lost control of the probe. It was acting.
Wait, is this like real life?
No. No, this is. Okay, this is it's very slow. Okay, because back in '75, getting something like this to even show as a prop takes quite a bit of money.
Yeah.
And this is a weekly television show, so this is like BattleBots.
There's a bunch of guys in there.
Yeah. So this is like, super BattleBot in super slow-mo. Oh, that's the laser. That's the laser. But I remember when I was a kid, it kind of dates me, right? So when I was a kid, I watched this episode and I go like, wow, this is kind of scary. None of the other episodes was really scary, but this one was. To me, it was scary because the robot was just fully autonomous. You cannot reason with it. It has a mind of its own, and it's not even a criminal. You cannot understand what it's trying to do. So it was kind of interesting. All right. So now it extends out another weapon. Now this is back in 1975, okay? So remember, in 1975, this is like kind of super duper top notch, prop here. Oh, there you go. There goes the laser. It's okay. Lee Major, this guy in the tractor, he's the quote unquote $6 million man. So he's half kind of like maybe a quarter or maybe 1/3 bionic. At the time, I thought it was really cool, and then later on, I thought about it, go like, no, it doesn't make any sense, because if your legs are all bionic, you can do all kinds of really do super leap, but your spine won't be able to handle it. It will just collapse the spinal column like that.
Maybe he has a bionic spinal support.
Then your organs won't be able to deal with it. You will be leaving your guts behind. Here's a hand-to-hand combat with a fully autonomous robot. So you guys can watch this, as you have time, okay? Because it ran away due to boredom. It's like, I am going back to bed. Okay, so you guys can watch this on your own, but it does kind of relate to what we're going to talk about, which is graphs, okay? So you would think, okay, robots, graphs, how can they possibly be related, right? So we'll talk about graphs a little bit, and then by the time we get to the algorithm for graphs, then we'll start to understand, okay, so maybe there is something related between robotics, AI, and graph theory, okay? So we'll talk about graph theory first, okay, and we'll dig through all the boring stuff first. So a lot of these are just definitions, they're kind of boring, okay, but it does give us the terminology that we need in order to talk about algorithms later on. So a graph, usually represented by uppercase G, but occasionally can be something else, is a two-tuple, okay? It's a two-tuple consisting of a set that we call the vertices, or some people call it nodes, okay? So if you see the term a vertex versus the term of a node, they're usually interchangeable in the discussion of graph theory. And then we have another set that we called edges, okay? So you got nodes and then, or vertices, and then you got edges. An edge is basically just a two-tuple to connect two vertices. Okay, so you have dots basically, and then you have lines connecting the dots. Just look at it that way. So V would be the set of all the dots that need to be that is of interest to you, and then E are the edges or the individual line segments connecting the dots. But each line only connect two dots. Are we doing okay so far with what a graph is from the mathematical point of view? Yep, go ahead.
Do they make faces?
Do
they make faces?
Faces?
Do they connect to make shapes?
Not necessarily. These are basically abstract dots. In other words, they are not necessarily planar. It's not necessarily something in 2D or even 3D space. But you can. Okay? There are special cases where the vertices represent coordinates in 2D space or 3D space. But they are not necessarily like that. Okay. Okay. So an element of V can be just about anything. It's basically representing something, okay? Each vertex is representing something, and then an edge is representing some kind of connectivity from one vertex to another vertex. So let's pick some examples here. Let's say you want to play chess, okay? When you play chess, each board configuration is a vertex, okay? Then what are the edges?
The pieces.
No. The moves, exactly. Yeah, go ahead.
Could you just say that E is a relation on V cross V?
It is a subset of, because you
Yeah.
cannot go more than that.
It's a relation on V.
It is
It's a subset
a
of V cross V.
it is a relation that two. Yeah, you can call it that way. You can say E is a relation on V. Yep,
Yeah,
that's
just
an
because
because it's a
we
two-tuple.
talked about that.
Yep. But that's one example. Another example, okay, when you consider Google Maps, the intersections can be considered the vertices. And then the connection between the vertices would be the pathway, okay, or a segment of the road to connect the intersections. Is that okay? What else? Well, let's think about something that we have done so far, okay? CNF, okay, and resolution. So when you're working with CNF, using resolution to prove by contradiction, remember that mess? Yeah? Okay, so the original CNF without any resolution steps performed can be one vertex, and every time you perform a resolution, you end up at a new vertex. Okay, so that's one way to look at it. So in that case, the application of a step of resolution is an edge because it's connecting from one vertex to another vertex. Is that okay? All right. But it can be anything. Okay. Basically, one is representing individual states that we are interested in. The other one is representing, okay, how can we go from one state to another state, or one place to another place? All right. So as such, an edge, which is an element in uppercase E, okay, I call it lowercase e here, is basically a two-tuple by itself with V1 and V2. In this case, I'll use V1, V2 as variables, whereas V1 and V2, they both have to be elements in the vertex set V. Is that okay? It's just a very kind of formal way to introduce what an edge is as opposed to what a vertex is. Are there any questions about these terms up to this point? Okay, so if you do want to use a kind of more graphical representation, you can just kind of say, okay, we have vertices. Okay, just draw some random dots on a piece of paper, and then you have edges to connect the dots. Okay, so that's a graph. Okay, so you have 5 dots. Okay, 5 elements in V, and then you just count the number of edges. 1, 2, 3, oops, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We have exactly 5 edges in this case. Are there any questions about edges versus vertices? No questions? Okay. So the next one talks about what we use graphs for, and it's very general. It can be used to model a lot of problems that we need to solve in computer science. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say that the edges seem to be clearly defined by the vertices. Is there an inverse relation there for the vertices?
Well, this requirement pretty much it basically said what you just mentioned, because each edge has to consist is a 2 tuple. Each item in the 2 tuple has to be an element in V. So there's that restriction on what can be in the set V. In other words, this is always true. Okay, E is always a subset of. It can be equal to. Okay, so this is not necessarily a proper subset, because when it is a proper subset, it's kind of like less than, where it is not equal to. But this is just a subset, not a proper subset of V Cartesian product V. Is that helping?
Well, I'm wondering about the because we're defining E in relation to V. I'm wondering if there's an inverse relation for V.
For V, well, you kind of always have to start with V first, and then you can see, okay, so how are these vertices connected, and that's E.
Okay, so in a way, V is kind of an independent variable, and E is more independent.
The elements inside V, well, there's no dependency defined. Is that okay? All right. Okay, so the next one, the next paragraph. Yes, go ahead.
What does it mean by the graph is directional?
The graph is directional means that each edge is a 2 tuple instead of a set.
Oh.
Okay, or you can say that this edge is considered different from this edge. Okay, now how can they possibly be different? Okay, it has to do with the cost function. So I'm just reading on to the third paragraph. The graph can be used to model a variety of problems, blah, blah, blah. Okay, but in this case, there's also a function f mapping each edge to a number, to a real number. Okay, so the cost function f is basically saying, okay, so how much, quote unquote, is it going to cost me to go from, in this case, vertex A to vertex B. If I say f of AB, then it is the cost to go from vertex A to vertex B. In the case of Google Maps, okay, it is important, okay, because it's time. How much time does it take to go from this particular point to this particular point over here? So it is important because time is what Google Maps uses to evaluate which route is better.
And also the set of variables will be different going the other way.
Exactly, because in San Francisco, for instance, okay, you have a lot of streets that are only one way. So there's no opposite edge, or you can say the edge of the opposite direction is infinite because you cannot do it. Now it's never really infinite because even if you get caught by a cop, there's always it's always about money and time, right? So some people may say, well, I'm going to go in opposite direction. I know that I can run into another car. Okay, I can get into a car accident. I can get caught by a cop. Okay, I can do. There's cost associated with it. But if to that particular person or to that particular application, the cost of missing the time is really high and the chances of getting into an accident is really low, maybe someone decides that it's worth it. Okay, so there's still a cost associated with it, but it is asymmetric. The point is, it is asymmetric. Going in one direction, it's not the same cost as going in the opposite direction. Now, to understand that part even more, you can watch an episode of Mythbusters, because they talk about making right turns as opposed to making left turns in San Francisco. Yeah. Which one is actually better? How many people kind of watched that episode and remember the conclusion?
Right.
You remember the
Yeah.
conclusion? It was a really interesting one because they tried to do it with a passenger car, and it was a draw. Okay, there was no advantage of making three. Let's see, 1, 2, 3. Making 3 right turns versus making a left turn. So with a passenger car, they did not see any improvement of fuel efficiency or time saving. But when they're in a truck, okay, a diesel truck, pretty big, like a delivery truck, like a UPS truck, they actually observed significant fuel saving in the process.
Making 3 right turns.
Making a left turn is worse than making 3 right turns. So I'll leave it up to you guys to look up that particular episode of Mythbuster and actually watch it, okay? Because it is kind of interesting, but it's once again it says there's something about asymmetric connections, okay? Something that seems to make sense to us. As it turns out, the cost is not intuitive, okay?
Well, I guess that even though 2 wrongs don't make a right, 2 rights make a left.
Well,
Well, if you're in a passenger car, at least.
yes. But sometimes 2 no's make a yes, and 2 yes makes a no.
Yeah, right.
Exactly. That's a no, right? That's a very cynical way of saying no. Yeah, right. So you have 2 affirmative, but it turns out to be a negative. It's a negation. A graph can also model complex problems to be solved. For example, a game of chess can be modeled as a graph. So in that particular case, what is interesting about that graph? Okay, it's not something that I'm going to test you on, but I just want to, yep.
When like a graph, wouldn't it be like diverging every single time you made a move there?
Oh yeah, yep. So it is a gigantic graph if you think about it. Okay, so you start with a default state, the start state of a chessboard, right? With all the pieces in place. Then for each possible move from the first player, it ends up at a new state. Okay? Now you turn the table and say, okay, for each possible state as the result of the first player making the first move, the second player can look at that board configuration and choose one of the possible moves. How many are there? Lots, right? So this particular graph will end with a checkmate from either side. Which also means that if a computer can look ahead of time and say, if I make this move, the worst scenario that I can end up with is a checkmate from the other side, I lose this game, that may not be a good direction to go. But if the computer can look ahead of time and say, if I make this move, there's no way I can lose this game. Hey, maybe that's the move that I want to make. Is that making any sense? So when people play chess, we cannot look ahead that many steps. So people use heuristics or rules of thumb. Okay, we learn from patterns. We learn from observing how other people play chess, right? So we say, okay, in this scenario, this is the best move. But we don't really look ahead of time and say, okay, in 24 steps, I'm going to checkmate, no matter what the opponent is going to do. Okay, we cannot look ahead that many steps, but computers can. But it is still represented by a graph, which also means if you have a really efficient way of going through that graph that is representing the states of a chess game, if you can go through that really fast and figure out, if I make this move, what is going to happen in the end, or what is the worst that can happen in the end, then you become a better chess player, especially when time is of essence. If you have to make a move within, let's say, I don't know, what is the time limit for a chess game, for a single move? 25 seconds. So if you have to come up with a decision in 25 seconds, and you can actually go through the entire graph to find the best move within like 20 seconds, then you almost are guaranteed to win the game or concede right away and say, oh, there's no way I can win this game. Within 25 seconds. But there's always the off chance that the opponent will make a mistake. So, but being able to look ahead and be able to analyze the graph is going to be helpful. So the next section here just talks about all these kind of terms, okay? But it is kind of important to go through the terms. The order of a graph, okay, order in double quotes because it is just a term that we use in graph theory, is the cardinality of the set V. In other words, it's just counting the number of vertices. The order is the number of vertices. A graph is considered simple if and only if the following is true. Now this is where I kind of want to point out that I prefer to use this type of notation whenever I can, because it is, to me, a little bit more concise and also a little bit more precise. If I get it wrong, I get it wrong. Okay, I can get something wrong. But if I'm right, there's only one way to interpret it. Okay, so in this case, we are saying for any two vertices, okay, pick W and V from the vertices. I want to look at this particular set. So the way you look at this is, oh, this is a big, huge mess. Well, don't look at it as a big, huge mess. Just look at each thing on its own individually. So we look at E, okay? E is an edge, okay? It has to be in the set E. And E equals to VW, or E equals to WV. So in other words, I don't really care which way I'm going, as long as there's an edge involving W and V. And as long as the cardinality of this is less than or equal to 1, it is considered a simple graph. In other words, there's only up to one edge between any two vertices. So in some cases, you can have multiple edges between two vertices, one going one way and the other one going the other way. So those would not be simple. Are there any questions about what makes a graph simple? A graph that is not simple is called a multigraph. Okay. The size of a graph, once again, size itself is double quoted because it is really just a term to refer to the number of edges. So here's a question. If I give you the number of vertices, can someone tell me what is the maximum size of that particular graph? Yep.
It's going to be a maximum of we choose 2. So v times v minus 1 and over 2. Like where v, I mean the absolute value, the size of v.
And that's assuming a multi-graph.
Yeah, otherwise it will be v squared.
Yep.
Or if you don't want edges going to the same point, then v squared minus v.
If you want the vertex cannot going back to itself.
Yeah.
Yep.
So the answer is there.
But this is really just the size is the number of edges in the graph. The complement of a graph is also interesting because the complement of a graph is basically asking where's the other half, okay? But what can you say about the other half? Okay, let's just take this one as an example. Okay, we'll take this graph as an example, and in this case we're going to talk about a undirected graph. Okay, so we are not even looking at the edges or the direction of the edges. So the complement of this graph has exactly the same vertices, but has all the other edges. Okay. So if I use a red pen to mark the complement, the edges of the complement of this particular graph, okay, so systematically I can go through each vertex and see what is missing. Okay, so in this case I'm missing one to go from here to here. So I have connectivity here, 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 and this one was already there. I look at the second one, I'm missing this edge here, I'm missing the edge here. So I go 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, if everything is accounted for, look at this one. We got 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, everything is there already. Look at the last one. Everything is there already. So in this case, the black edges versus the red edges, they are basically quote unquote complements of each other. Is that okay? So when you look at the complement, it's really just saying, okay, what are the missing ones? What are the missing edges in this case? So the complement has exactly the same vertices because they all have V in this case as the set of all vertices, but the edges is what makes it different. Okay, are there any questions about this? Okay. Yep. Mm-hmm.
So when you're saying it's simple, it only has one edge between the two vertices? That's
Right.
what that means?
Yep.
Okay. I didn't understand the difference between when it's not simple.
Not simple means this rule does not apply to all vertices anymore.
Okay.
You may still have vertices where you only have one or even no edges, but then in a not simple graph, or in this case in a multi-graph, you will find that between two vertices there are at least between a pair of vertices, two vertices, there are two edges connecting them. Okay, so moving on to the next one. Two vertices VW are quote-unquote adjacent in a graph if and only if the edge involving V and W is in the edges, or WV is also in the edges. So if the two edges, or if the two vertices are connected by an edge, then these two vertices are considered quote-unquote adjacent. Is that okay? All right. And this is the most confusing part of the terminology. If you find an edge VW, okay, V as the first item and W as the second item of a two-tuple, in this case, V is known as the tail and W is known as the head, which is somewhat counterintuitive because we usually consider the first thing the head and then the second thing the tail. But in this case, you can think of an arrow. Okay, the arrow is going from V to W. As a result, V has the tail of the arrow, as opposed to W, which is pointed to by the head of an arrow. Okay, I know some of you are taking archery, so this will be an easier one to remember. In the graph, the in degree is basically the following. Okay, it's D underscore I with a V inside. But let's just look at what this is. Okay, we are taking the cardinality of a set. We are counting the number of things in this particular set. What are we counting? Each thing in the set is an element of E. It is an edge. What is the extra requirement for this particular edge? In this particular edge, we want to make sure that there is a W. Okay, there exists a W in the vertices such that E is connecting W to V. Now, the important part here is the direction, because we are saying that we have an edge going from W to V. And so we are basically counting how many ways can we get to V? How many edges end up at V? Is that okay? And that's why it's called the in degree of V. The I is really just notating that this is the inside as opposed to out. Is that okay? Are there any questions about the notation itself? D subscript I in parentheses, the vertex, is measuring how many edges are going into this particular vertex. Question?
I didn't see that in the notation how it's catching more than one edge.
Touching more than one edge.
Because you said it's counting how many edges are going into V,
But okay, so let's look at all the elements of this particular set. Okay, the set notation goes from here all the way up to here, right? So this is the set of all edges E. Okay, so E has to be an edge because it has to be in the set E itself. But the other requirement is you have to be able to find a W inside the vertices such that E is connecting the W to V. This V is the same as this V here. Yep. So it's basically the set of all edges ending up at V. Mm-hmm. And then the other one is the out degree. The out degree is really just the opposite. If you look at these two definitions, okay, let me highlight which two. If you look at this definition and you look at this definition, only two things are really different. The first one is the I is an O now because it's an in versus the out. And then the other one is the direction of the W versus the V, because this one is basically counting how many edges are going out of vertex V instead of going in to vertex V. Okay. A graph is considered complete if and only if the following is true. Okay, so let's check out what is true here. So for any two vertices in V, okay, so in other words, pick any two items in V, they can be the same, okay? So you can say, oh, let's consider the same vertex, V and W turn out to be the same element in V. That's okay, we can take care of that because we only pay attention when V and W are not the same. In other words, this part is qualifying and say it's the equivalent of saying for any two vertices that are different in subset in the set V, let's go through the rest of the definition. VW is in E. In other words, they're all connected. All vertices are connected by edges. In this case, they're all directional as well. So we basically say there's a way to go from any vertex to any other vertex through a particular edge. That makes it complete. Is that okay? All right. But it does not count by going back to itself. Okay. So you do not need an edge to go from one vertex to go back to itself in order for the graph to be complete. The following terms are also kind of important. Okay, a walk is basically an n-tuple of vertices. So we borrow the bracket notation from array indexing to identify the ith item, and we're going to use the zero-oriented approach, just like in C and C++. So in this case, a walk W. Okay, excuse my overloading of the lowercase w symbol, but in this case it's called a walk. Okay, a walk is basically, if you want to use an array to refer to it, that's fine. Okay, so W is an array of vertices where the vertices are connected by edges. Is that okay? If you look at each vertex, or excuse me, if you look at each edge as an individual step, this makes a walk. A walk is basically a chain of steps where they are all connected. Okay. Are there any questions about the definition of a walk? Can we end up at exactly the same spot? Yes. Can we go back and forth between just two steps? Yes. So a walk does not preclude from repetition or going back and forth between just two vertices. They're all walks. Okay, so as long as the vertices are connected by edges, you're good. Yep.
So it's going from one vertex to the other just one time would be a walk?
Yes, you can have a walk with only one single edge. Okay, so let's take a look at the actual mathematical definition of this. So this is how we can define a walk. W is a walk if it satisfies this requirement. So first of all, we basically say, okay, how long can a walk be? In this case, I use the natural numbers. This is really just a long way to spell out and say that I is a natural number and it has to be less than bar W bar minus 1. In other words, we are looking at all the valid indexes into the walk. Minus the last one, because the last index is bar W bar minus 1. So if x has to be less than bar W bar minus 1, it is from 0 all the way up to the second last element of the array. W itself is an array, okay, because it's a walk, which is basically an array of vertices. And in this case, I can be a number from 0 all the way up to the second last element, or the index of the second last element of the walk W. Okay, so what about I? Okay, we know that I is just an index. The requirement on I is expressed here. W bracket I, which is spelling out one particular vertex in the walk, comma, W in square brackets I plus 1, which is the next item in the walk. There has to be an edge connecting those two. So that's why when I put parentheses around these two vertices, I can now say, okay, it is an element of E. That is a requirement. They have to be connected. Is that okay? What a walk is? Both just intuitively and also just in terms of the mathematical definition. Okay? So now we talk about what a path is, okay? A path is a walk. So in this case, a path P is a walk, so it satisfies this requirement. But in addition to that, there has to be no repetition. In this case, the repetition applies to vertices. You cannot go back to the same vertex in the path. So a path cannot be a circle, because a circle goes back to the same point. It basically just means that every single vertex in the path has to be unique within the path itself. Is that okay? A trail is a walk that has no repeated edge. So that makes it a little bit different from a path. A path cannot have a repetition of a vertex But a trail simply means you cannot reuse a single edge. You can go back to the same vertex, you just cannot use the same edge going in or out of that vertex. Is that okay? And then a tour is a trail, which is this one here, where the first and the last vertex is the same. Now, it doesn't say whether this is the only vertex that has to be the same. So the interpretation, if you're given this type of definition, it has no clear definition of whether other vertices can be repeated in the trail or not. So by default, it should be allowed. And then the last one is a planar graph. A planar graph is one that can be drawn in 2D with no crossing lines. Now, this is an interesting one, okay, because it applies in realistic cases to routing a circuit board. Okay? In other words, how many edges or how many vertices can you connect before you say, okay, I have no options anymore. I need to either use a wire to help me connect from one contact point to another contact point because there's no way to use a trace on the circuit board to do it. So we'll take a quick look at this one because it is a little bit interesting. So you can kind of work this out on your own as well. If I have a vertex, now we are talking about undirected here, okay? Because on the circuit board, the traces are undirected. Okay, it doesn't matter whether you go from A to B or B to A. It goes in both directions. Conduction goes in both directions. So we look at a graph of 2 and say, well, that's pretty easy. That's planar. Because I don't need to go out of the whiteboard to connect these 2 dots without crossing over. Okay, 3 is pretty easy too, right? It's fully connected. 4, you might say 4 is kind of difficult because we can do this. What about this one? Well, we can go like that. That's not a problem. It's still planar. When you get to 5, if you want to have a fully connected graph of 5 vertices, undirected, then we have a problem. Because now we have 5 edges, and some people say, well, that's pretty easy. Just make a star and then connect the other edges. But the star itself has crossing lines. Okay, so we cannot do that. Okay, so we can do the easy part first. Okay, we can do the easy part like that. And then we say, okay, let's focus on this node first. So now this node or this vertex is done. Okay, it is fully connected to the other 4. Then we look at this guy here and go like, it is connected to these 2. We still need to connect to this and this, but we cannot cross over. Okay, that's fine. We'll just fly over like that. Okay, so now this node is okay. I'll just use a circle to represent the ones that are done already. We look at this one here. We're like, okay, it's connected to this, it's not connected to this one, and it's already connected to this one. Now I don't have a choice anymore. There's no way to connect this guy to this guy without crossing an existing line. Is that okay? All right. What about this one? This one is connected to this. It's not. It is connected to this one because it is bidirectional, and it's also connected to this one. So we only have one problem vertex here, which is this guy. And there's no way to draw an edge from this one to this one over here without crossing over another line. So a fully connected graph having only 5 vertices is not planar. Cannot be done on a 2D plane. Is that okay? Is anyone interested to know, okay, in the circuit, design, application, if you do have a circuit design where you do need this connection from here to here, what are we going to do? Sorry?
Have it on the other side.
Okay, to go onto the other side means that your circuit board needs to be able to have 2 copper layers, one on the top and one at the bottom. In addition to that, it also means that you need a way to electrically connect a signal from the top layer to the bottom layer. Okay, so how is that done? Okay, we can have a 2-layer board that can do this, but how is a 2-layer board done?
You drill a hole.
You have to drill a hole. Okay, very good. So let's look at the cross section of a circuit board. Okay, so the cross section of a 2-layer circuit board looks like this. The material in between is usually FR4, which is a fiberglass material, which is really strong. And that's why, has anyone tried to break apart a circuit board, like the size of a motherboard? Like when it doesn't work anymore, you get into a real rage situation, you want to break it apart. Could you do it? Not without scoring it first. Okay, so you need to use a razor blade to score the board first. Then you might have a chance to actually breaking it. But to break a circuit board in half just by sheer strength is very, very hard. Some people may be able to do it, but it's really hard because it's actually fiberglass. With fiber going in two different directions, so it's really strong. Okay, but the point here is, if I have a signal that goes from here and I need it to end up here, okay, just drilling a hole is not going to help because the hole is not conductive, because FR4 is not a conducting material, otherwise we will be in big trouble. Okay, so what people do is they put a via, VIA, they insert basically a very small and thin copper tube into the hole, so that when they tin the whole thing, basically put in lead or some other alloy material, when they tin, then it makes the connection, the electrical connection from the top layer to the bottom layer. That's how a 2-layer board is done. How many layers do you think your circuit board, your motherboard on your computer has? 5, 6, possibly 7 even. So you have basically, you're sandwiching FR4s and copper layers up to like 6. It's kind of like a sandwich of 6 stuffing in between. And then you can have internal vias, which means this is completely inside and sandwiched by other layers. You cannot even see these particular vias. They're called blind vias. So kind of fun stuff if you're designing circuit boards, but it does relate to graph theory. Okay? So for the most part, we are in this class, we are going to talk about directed as opposed to undirected graphs. In an undirected graph, it simply means the edges are not directional. Okay. So there are unique and interesting theorems that only apply to graphs that are undirected. But in this class, we talk mostly about die graphs or directed graphs. The die comes from directed. This part talks a little bit about graphs and encryption. I'm not going to talk about this. We'll kind of skip this portion here. But basically, if anyone wants to get into computer security, and not only to learn how to configure Windows, throw a few switches, install a few apps to make it secure, but you actually want to get into cryptography, like how do we crack encryption and that sort of thing, graph theory becomes a cornerstone, a keystone theory of encryption methods. So anyone who wants to get into actual encryption math, you have to understand graph theory really well to get it done. Okay. Are there any questions about that part? Any comments? Does anyone want to get into cryptography in this class at some point? Nobody.
Maybe.
Possibly, okay? Maybe, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, let me just give you one particular application, that might be interesting. Remember MD5 hash and how it was used to secure passwords? Okay, how many people know that part and how many people do not know that part? I'll just have people raising your hand. Okay, there are a few people turning their heads. Okay, that's fine. So we'll look up MD5, okay? So MD5 is what we consider a hash function. And as a hash function, okay, if you look at Wikipedia, it probably will give you the pseudocode and the actual C code to do it. So it produces a 128-bit hash value. 128-bit divided by 8, you get how many bytes? 16 bytes, okay? So it'll give you a 16-byte hash value if you just give it a string, okay? So let's say my password to the power server is secret, S-E-C-R-E-T, okay? One of the worst possible passwords to choose, right? But let's say it is secret. So when you spell out secret, we represent each character using ASCII code, right? So lowercase s, lowercase e, they're all ASCII code. So you pass this string to the MD5 algorithm, the hash function. It'll give you 16 bytes of bits, okay? A whole bunch of zeros and ones. So what servers usually do is to store the hashed value of a password instead of the plain text of the password itself, okay? So what if someone is to look into the password file, storing all the hash values, and say, ha, I can see your password file, I can now hack into your system. Well, not so fast, okay? I can show you exactly what is in the password file. So let's switch to a command line here. Probably have to change to root first, right? Which is the administrator account. So now I can go to a file called shadow. Okay, this is a fairly typical Linux configuration. And I can look up root, which is the top item here. I'm going to turn off syntax highlighting. So when you look up the first entry here, you will see a whole bunch of mumbo jumbo, blah, 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 like this, okay? This is basically the 64-based encoded version of the hash value of my actual password. Now, you guys know the password already. If you don't, you can just look up my documentation, because this is a live system. It has no outside connectivity, so knowing the password of root is not going to help anyone to crack into this system. So the root password is actually beer, B-E-E-R, lowercase. Does that spell out beer to you? No. So when you get a hold of this password file, which is actually read protected from anyone except for the root or the administrator account of this computer, they only see this part, okay? So they have to figure out what string, okay, would actually end up with this particular hash value. And that was considered a very hard problem before, okay? Knowing the hash value is this mumbo jumbo, finding the string, or a string, okay, that is the most important part, finding a string whose hash value is this thing was considered difficult, okay? Because how many bits do we have in, well, okay, 128 bits, right? So that means, there are how many possible hash values?
128.
Exactly, we have this many individual hash values. This is one of those. So the question is, what string will give me that particular hash value? Well, you can test it, right? You can test and say, okay, let's try out the hash value of a single letter A. No. Let's try AA. No. AAA. No. AAAA. No. And keep going, okay? You can just do an exhaustive search. Yes?
Wait, even if you had the hash value, wouldn't you need the hash table to match the, like, even
No,
if you
because
have-
it's computed. So what happens when I sign in is on the keyboard, I would type in beer, right? B-E-R, press the enter key. So what the computer would do is it will immediately compute the MD5 hash of what I typed in to match the hash value that is actually stored in this file. If the hashed values match, then I authenticate just fine. If the hashed values do not match, then I do not authenticate. But the system does not actually store the password itself, which means you cannot just go into this file and say, oh, okay, beer is the password, and you're done for the day. Yep.
What if someone were to edit that value, would it then not let you sign in?
If someone can modify this file, yes, then that person can modify this to a known hash value of a particular string, then that person can use that string to log in. And that's how you can reset the password of a Windows NT, which is basically all Windows, current versions of Windows. That's why there's a tool to do that to the Hive or the stored values for signing in. So you can actually recover, not to recover, but you can sign into a Windows system if you have a utility program like that at boot time. Okay? But remember what I said, it was considered difficult, not anymore. Okay? What is the mechanism that made MD5 hash no longer a secure method? In other words, someone can look at this and go like, yeah, I can figure out what string to type on the keyboard to sign in as root. The mechanism has a name of rainbow table. So a rainbow table is a pre-computed table to reverse, in this case, the MD5 hash back to a string that can produce that particular hash value. Somebody, okay, with a lot of processing power on hand, was actually able to compute for each and every single hash value what string will produce that particular hash value. Okay, now we are talking about a lot of strings here, so it's a huge table, but nonetheless somebody pre-computed everything, and now it's in a table. So now that you have everything in a table, it just becomes a table lookup. Now it can be sorted by the hashed value themselves, which is just a long number, which is a 128-bit number. But when you have a 128-bit number, there are many quick ways to locate a item in that table. Okay? The first one is what? What is the quickest way to locate an item in a table that has 2 to the 128 power items? Most people will think about what we just recently talked about, binary search, right? So binary search will take 128 comparisons in order to get to the entry that you need. But there's a faster way. You just index it. If you know that one item is always a fixed size, you can just index it. Because we know in this table, everything is used up. So you can just index into it. And that takes constant time. Now you can say that, well, but it's going to be a pretty big hard drive to be able to store this many entries. Yes, it's going to be a big hard drive. But nonetheless, if you know the offset onto the sector that you need on that hard drive, it still only takes a few milliseconds to get to it. Is that making any sense? Okay. So with the availability of a rainbow table for MD5 hash, particularly in this case, it basically means if you store the password as MD5 hash, it is no longer secure. Yep.
So I guess the defense against that would be to just modify modify and go MD6 or something.
Well, they have different ways to kind of reduce the issues related to MD5. So one is salted MD5. Okay, salted MD5 is basically a way to improve the security. Okay, the other one is not to use MD5 at all, and you use SHAR instead, or SHAR1 in this case. So SHAR1 is another hash function. It is considered considerably more secure compared to MD5, because in SHA-1 it produces a 20-byte hash value as opposed to a 16-byte hash value. So you have that extra 8 bytes, or 4 bytes in this case. But 4 bytes would increase the number of entries by 4 billion something, right? It's 4 billion something times the number of hash values for MD5.
So it becomes less practical to make a table.
Yes, with the current technology and the current technology both in terms of computation power as well as storage, because you don't want to go through this every single time. You want to be able to store the entire table, but this table will be 4 billion the size of the other table, which is a bit bigger. Okay, which basically means it would take a few years for technology to catch up. Then SHA-1 will become not so useful anymore. Yep.
So in the table that you just showed us, if you entered in the hash value on your console, it would output beer, or
no, it will give you a string, not necessarily beer, but it will give you a string so that the hash value of that string matches the hash value that you are looking for.
Okay, but since multiple strings can have the same
Yep.
hash value,
Yep.
you aren't guaranteed to get the right.
That is correct. Because the hash function is not, but this is great. Okay. Think about this. Think about the universe of all possible strings. Okay? And we're not going to talk about strings of infinite characters. Let's just look at strings that can be up to 255 characters. Okay? Which is limited. That space is limited, right? So when you look at that space, okay, which is your domain, and then you look at the space of all the possible hash values, which is the set of all integers from 0 up to 2 to the power of 128 minus 1, right? Which set is bigger? The set of all the strings that you can come up with using 255 characters, as opposed to the set of all integers from 0 up to 2 to the power of 128, the whole thing minus 1. Which one is bigger? The domain is bigger. The set of all the strings is bigger. Does that make any sense? Okay? So in that case, that tells you right away this function is, you guys will go like, no, we don't want surjectiveness anymore. Is it bijective? No. Why is it not bijective?
Because it has to point to more than.
Because it is surjective, but it is not injective. So if it is not injective, it implies that multiple things from the domain can map to the same thing in the codomain. So the rainbow table is not a inverse function, because the function is the hash function itself is not bijective. You cannot have a inverse function. But it is a way to say, well, we don't really care where we map back to. We just need to map back to one of the many things that can map to a particular hash value. Because for cracking purposes, that's all you need. Yep.
Is that actually essential that there isn't an inverse function?
Well, if there's no inverse function, you can have a collision. That is also a problem of MD5. Because MD5 hash was also used to double check whether your file is intact or not, or whether it comes from the correct source or not. Okay, example. Let's say you want to update the firmware or the operating system of your phone, okay, Android or otherwise, okay, doesn't matter. So when you download that huge file, which is supposed to be image to override the image currently on your phone, okay, you probably want to make sure it is not a hacked version where there's a gigantic backdoor for hackers to go into your phone. Does that make sense? Okay. So how can you be sure? So the approach was to sign, attach a. It's not really a signature anymore, but they attach an MD5 hash of the original file itself and say, okay, after you receive this file, do an MD5 function on the entire file, which is going to be big because that's your entire operating system. But nonetheless, it is just one single file. So if the hash value of what you download matches the published MD5 hash that is published by, let's say, Google or whoever is making your phone, then you say, oh, okay, there's a pretty good chance that this is an authentic image for my phone. But remember, the function is not injective, which means there are other files that can also generate exactly the same MD5 hash. So what a hacker needs to do, in this case, is to create the bad version of Android, make a bad Android, okay, and attach additional files so that it will give you the same MD5 hash as an authentic image of Android. Then your MD5 hash will succeed and say that, yep, it matches, but it really is not the file that you're supposed to download. Is that making any sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay? So that's why MD5 hash is not really useful for most things anymore. If security is really, really important, it's not important anymore. But it does cost a hacker quite a bit of time and resources to generate, to basically make a file appear to be authentic, even in the case of MD5. And if you're talking about the daily release of Android, it's not worth the time to do it. Yep.
I read an article on that where, because of the tables that they're making, they're constantly getting bigger, and the computer's constantly getting faster, that the only way to combat that was to use a random generator to make your passwords.
Well, the whole approach of using password is really should be a thing of the past. Okay, so how do you sign in? If password is no longer really reliable anymore?
Biometrics.
Biometrics is not reliable either. Okay, because you can get a fingerprint of someone pretty easily. Okay, if you watch the movie Gattaca, you know that even DNA sample is not really reliable because that can also be faked. Okay, what is the cheap, easy way to authenticate when you go buy something on Amazon or when you sign into Google, that Google know that you are not necessarily you, but you are the person who is supposed to possess the only thing that only you should possess?
Password?
Hmm?
The text? Password?
Password is weak. Okay, it's a weak approach.
They'll authenticate through email or through text.
Two-factor.
Yep, two-factor. Basically, it's basically a two-factor sign-in. Okay, so when you look up two-factor sign-in, just look up Wikipedia, look up Google, look up Apple ID. It's basically in addition to a password or replacing a password. Sometimes you have something that is external. Okay, so you can use the technology of texting. Okay, in other words, every time you want to sign into your bank account, for instance, okay? So you go to the bank website and you say, okay, I'm so and so, this is my password, I want to sign in. So you can go through the first stage of sign in, but then the second stage of sign in is your bank will come back and say, okay, I just texted you a number. It can be a small number, it can be a 5-digit base 10 number, it doesn't have to be really big. And the bank will say, okay, what number did I just text you? Okay, and that number is only good for 2, 3, maybe 5 minutes. So after 5 minutes, you can type in that number, it's no longer valid. Then you have to go through the whole process again, and the bank will send you another number that you have to punch in order to authenticate. So in this particular way, even if someone is to be able to hack your password, that person without your phone, okay, or without access to the text message of your phone to be exact, because they may not need the physical phone. If they have a way to access your text on your phone, they can still accomplish the same thing. So unless that person has access to the text of your phone, that person will still not be able to sign in as you. Okay, so that's considered a two-factor sign-in, because now in addition to your password, there's something else that only you should have access to. How many people know banks or financial institutions already starting to do that? Yep, there you go.
And Steam does that.
Even Steam does that, yep. Yep.
So why don't people just use like limited tries for your password if there's like multiple hashes, right? You know what I mean? Like you only get 3. You know how like on like Apple phones you get like 3 tries and then you have to try again in another minute. So if there's multiple like passwords for the same hash. Wouldn't that also be an easy approach?
They have hash matching software, so they have the hash on their computer, and they don't actually put in the password.
Oh, they just put in that. Okay, I see.
Yeah, well, in the case of Apple, it is interesting because the operating system will wipe its own content after a certain number of failed login. We know that because of the San Bernardino, case. The FBI got a hold of the phone of one of the people who was involved, and it couldn't crack it, right? So what happened? Did you guys follow that story?
They paid a company to crack it for them.
Well, they tried to get Apple to do it, right?
Yeah, and Apple said no.
And why do you think Apple said no?
They didn't want.
First
they didn't want
Amendment.
anyone to know how to do
I
it.
heard that if they had gone to Apple early enough, Apple could have done it, but they, because they waited and it wiped everything off of there. That was where the problems came in.
They
That's
said they didn't
the-
want them to have like the ultimate key to unlock every phone.
Because they wanted them to put in back doors so they'd be able to just get in whenever they wanted.
They
Okay.
don't want people to know that they've got back doors.
Yep. Okay, go ahead.
If you break the security for one person, you have to automatically break the security for every person. So like by compromising the security of the iPhone, that also means that nobody will ever like use it for business or for anything that requires like privacy and security, like money transfers and whatnot. So Apple was obviously reluctant to make it known that they had a backdoor or something like that. It would have definitely hurt them.
Yeah, you got that right. Okay, it is a marketing issue and publicity issue more so than it is a technology issue. Because Apple can, because the FBI can just ship or personally have an agent to carry that iPhone to the Apple headquarters and say, crack just this phone. We are not interested in the phone of Oprah or any of the celebrities, right? We just need this phone cracked, okay? But once people understand that Apple has a way to crack any iPhone, that impacts, how Apple, or the image of Apple in the minds of their other customers.
Perception issue.
Exactly. Because now the FBI can take another iPhone from another person and say, can you crack this one too? Okay, so where's the limit? Where is it gonna end? So I think it's a publicity image. I'm pretty sure Apple has a way to do it. Okay, I don't think they will do something like where there's no way to reverse it.
They do. I've had Apple laptop issues before, and they just were able to get in without my password.
Yep. Now, of course, for those of you who want to, improve the security of your personal device, I'm not going to ask why you want to do this, but instead of just locking it up, you can instead of just you can just wipe it. Now, you can make it to the point for people who are really paranoid about people or companies or the government cracking into your personal devices, you can make it even so that if you don't check in every day and say that yes, I am well and alive, then there's nothing wrong with my life. If you miss like 1 day of checking in with your phone, it will automatically erase everything automatically. So it is not something that is triggered by like the 4th time you sign in incorrectly. It's just the lack of checking in. It's called a watchdog timer mechanism. Okay, so for people who are really paranoid about stuff like that, they can probably do something like that. But the downside of that is, if you go camping, and your phone went dead because there's no way to recharge your phone. The next time you charge your phone, you power up, the phone goes like, it has been 6 days, since I was, since I confirmed that your well-being, it's time to self-destruct. That may not be pleasant. But for people who are really paranoid and say, I would much rather have the phone self-destruct, rather than having my secrets disclosed, that may be a good trade-off. All right. Well, we are running out of time today, so to prepare for Wednesday, I would like you guys to read this particular graph, traversal, and searching algorithm. So we'll focus on algorithms next time we come back. I will. It's still being recorded. Yeah.